My aim this evening is to explore a central issue, indeed the central issue, in moral philosophy, the relation of scientific knowledge to moral principles. By scientific knowledge, I mean science insofar as it tells us what is the case. For even if there is a sense in which science tells us what ought to be the case, and there is such a sense, we can distinguish, as we shall see, between science qua telling us what is the case and science in its role of telling us what ought to be. The original question could indeed be reformulated in terms of the relationship between these two roles. The sciences I have in mind include everything from logic and mathematics at one end of the spectrum to psychology and the social sciences on the other. And since the issue I have in mind is a conceptual one, which does not hinge on the current status of any of these sciences, I shall not hesitate to make thought experiments which amount to philosophical fiction about science. Before I get the substantive part of my argument underway, I must introduce some terms and draw some distinctions. The terms will be used in a technical sense, though I hope that they will group together in a perspicuous way things which can be seen to belong together from the high altitude of abstraction in which our problem exists. First, a few words about moral principles. At this stage, it will be useful to give what might be called the standard account. Whether or not, or to what extent, the features of this account apply to anything in our experience will be left open for the time being. In philosophy, one rarely begins by being absolutely clear about one piece of a conceptual puzzle and unclear about the rest. Philosophical perplexities tend to spread, and often the things which seem obvious when one begins become even more puzzling than the initial problem. According to the standard account, a moral principle is a statement which says what people ought to do in a certain kind of circumstance. It is added that to be a moral principle, the people in question must be all of us. And to be a principle, in the sense of first principle, it must not be an application of a more general principle in the way in which, for example, everybody ought to keep his written promises follows from everybody ought to keep his promises, or in which, with the additional premise that measles is a distress, everybody ought to help people with measles follows from everybody ought to help people in distress. Two other features belong to the standard account, at least in its more sophisticated forms. Since principles of the kind I have formulated can conflict, they must be regarded as abstractions from more complicated principles which specify what ought to be done in combinations of the kind of circumstance mentioned in these simpler principles. This qualification has the consequence that principles, properly speaking, are far more complicated than the sort of thing we usually give as examples. For these, on reflection, always carry the rider, other things being equal, which they rarely are. Indeed, it commits us to the idea that a moral principle, properly speaking, specifies the circumstances in which a certain kind of action ought to be done in a very complex way. Yet they remain principles in that they apply to anybody in that kind of circumstance. It has the further consequence that instead of moral principles, unlike copybook maxims, being already at hand, our task being merely to apply them, serious moral thinking starts from the complexities of the actual case and arrives at a conclusion concerning the principle which applies, i.e. concerning what anybody ought to do in that kind of circumstance, in the very process of arriving at a conclusion concerning what I ought to do in that case. Yet we can abstract for the moment from this latter feature and suppose that however difficult it may be to arrive at them, moral principles are in some sense there to be arrived at. This brings me to another feature of the standard account. Moral principles, however complex, are objective in the sense that there is truth and falsity about them, that thinking doesn't make them so, that there are false beliefs about moral principles just as there are false beliefs about scientific laws. Of course, if moral principles were scientific laws, or if they were uniquely determined by scientific laws, There would be nothing paradoxical about this, nor about the difficulty of discovering what we ought to do. Moral truth would be either a special case of scientific truth or a consequence of scientific truth. But against this, it is urged that science tells us what is the case, and moral principles tell us what ought to be the case, and one can't get from is to ought. Finally, according to the standard account, not only can we be mistaken about what we ought to do, even when we are quite confident that we know what we ought to do, we may well fail to do so. Duty may fall before inclination. But before we beard the venerable puzzle of the relation of is to ought, which is simply a restatement of our original topic, more distinctions are in order. Let me first introduce the expression to value, as in the context, X, a certain person, values Y, where Y is a state of affairs. For example, X is having a substantial income, or perhaps the Washington Senators winning the pennant. The latter example is intended to bring out the fact that the states of affairs valued need not exist, and it need not include the person who does the valuing. Indeed, I shall so use the expression that the state of affairs valued is always in the future, for we are concerned with action, and it seems unlikely that action can influence the past. The state of affairs a person values, in this technical sense, can be very complex. Indeed, what people value is purely a function of its context and implications, and their valuing involves preferring some states of affairs to others. But there is, I believe, no need to spend time in botanizing the complications which any attempt to classify valuings must involve. Such distinctions as I will draw arise naturally, I believe, out of the broader requirements of our problem. As a final preparation, let me call attention to the difference between the expression of a valuing and the ascription of a valuing to someone. Suppose that Jones values the Senators winning the pennant this year. The statement, in our terminology, which ascribes this valuing to Jones is simply, Jones values the Senators winning the pennant this year. Other statements in more ordinary speech, which ascribe valuings of various kinds to persons, would be Jones wishes that such and such were the case. Jones aims at such and such. Jones intends that. Jones has such and such a purpose, such and such a goal, and so on. But remember, I'm introducing this rubric of valuing simply to highlight the overall structure of our problem. Anybody with the relevant information, including Jones himself, can ascribe a valuing to Jones. On the other hand, only Jones himself can express his valuings. This he may do, for example, by saying, "Would that the Senators won this year." There are many ways of giving expression to valuings, and indeed, different valuings call for different sentences to express them. But the pattern of my argument as a whole will stand out more clearly if we rise above detail and use the above as our standard sentence for the expression of a valuing. Thus, even the valuing of an action a person is about to perform will be supposed to have as its expression, "Would that I shortly did A." In other words, I'm using the "would that" something with the case as the expressive rubric, and I'm using Jones values or X values something for the ascription of the value. I pointed out that anybody, including Jones himself, can ascribe a valuing to Jones. Thus, Jones can say, "I wish that the Senators would win this year," or in our straitjacket, "I value that the Senators win this year." Notice that this self-ascription can serve as a secondary expression of the valuing. For, "Would that the Senators won this year, but I don't value that the Senators win this year," is as conceptually absurd as, "It is raining, but I don't think it is." Two final points. To value something is to be disposed to think thoughts properly expressed by "would that such and such were the case," and to value all things considered, an action, which one can do right here and now is to do the action, or at least to try to do it. Value is in that way connected with what we do. Let us now introduce a team of scientists on the scene. First, let them be quite ordinary, and let them do something simple. They see Jones near a heavy object, O, a long rod, R, and a stone. They mobilize their science and agree that a necessary condition of Jones raising the stone is his using the rod as a lever. They then rephrase this as, Jones raising O implies Jones using rod R as lever. So far, so good. Then we suddenly find them saying, if Jones wants to raise O, values raising O, he ought to use the rod as a lever. Here the word ought has crept in, and yet seems to belong in a tough-minded scientific way. Suppose they now hear Jones say, would that I raised the object. They infer, naturally enough, that he values the state of affairs of his raising the object. He wants to raise the object. Can they conclude Jones ought to use the rod as lever? I.e., can they determine what Jones ought to do? The answer seems clearly no. Consider the parallel case, where they pool their scientific knowledge and agree, if Jones wants to poison his aunt quickly, he ought to give her prussic acid. And then they hear him say, oh, would that I poison my aunt quickly. Suppose they come to Jones and say, if other things being equal, you value poisoning your aunt quickly, then, the same things being equal, you ought to give her prussic acid. There seems to be no absurdity in their adding, or anybody who agrees with their scientific information, but of course you ought not to poison your aunt. You ought not to give her prussic acid. The ought that we found above does not seem to be a moral ought. The point is a familiar one, but its exact nature must be spelled out, for after a few turns and twists, it will enable us to clarify and finally resolve our problem. Clearly, the scientific information could have been directly communicated to Jones before it was put in terms of ought, in which case, if he was convinced of its truth, he too could have made the move to ought. Thus, if other things being equal, I want to poison my aunt quickly, I ought, same things being equal, to give her prussic acid. And it is clear that what this amounts to is that the valuing expressed by would that I poison my aunt quickly is logically tied to the valuing expressed by would that I gave her prussic acid, by virtue of the scientific facts of the case. In general terms, if X wants A or values A, he ought to bring about B, tells us that if X were to think, would that A, but would that I not bring about B, his valuings would be inconsistent. Of course, people often hold inconsistent values. And even when they are persuaded that these valuings are inconsistent, they do not always change their minds and substitute consistent valuings. Thus, suppose the scientists approach Jones and persuade him that bringing about A implies bringing about B. He may move with alacrity to the thought, if other things being equal, I value bringing about A, then I ought, same things being equal, to bring about B. And yet continue to think both, would that I brought about A, and would that I not bring about B. The situation, then, is the same with respect to our valuings as with respect to our beliefs. We may well continue to hold inconsistent beliefs even after we've been shown that they are inconsistent. Yet logic has some grip on our minds, and if, for our present purposes, we exaggerate, we can say that a person who is convinced that bringing about A implies bringing about B, and hence that if other things being equal, I value bringing about A, then I ought to bring about B, will abandon either would that I brought about A or would that I not bring about B. If we can sum up the apparent moral of our discussion to date, we can sum up the present moral of the situation to date by saying that although the ought of if X wants A, he ought to do B, looks as though it concerned the propriety of doing B on a certain hypothesis, it actually concerns the logical propriety or impropriety of certain complex valuings. To offer advice of the form, if you want A, you ought to do B, is not to offer substantive advice, as does you ought to do X, period. It is to give logical advice. We seem to have shown that the ought which our team of scientists can generate, these oughts are not the oughts which tell us what to do, but rather oughts which pertain to the coherence of our valuings. Since the oughts of moral principles do tell us what to do, it would seem that the oughts which scientists generate are not the oughts of morals. Yet is this so clear? After all, even if the oughts which our team of scientists have come up with do in a certain sense pertain to the coherence of Jones's valuings, they are formulated in such a way that they take action expressions as their objects. If X wants A, he ought to do B. That doesn't talk about coherence of valuings, it would seem. Thus, the mere fact that moral oughts tell us what we ought to do is no decisive argument against the idea that they too, pertain to the coherence of our valuings. And let me develop this thought. It will not have gone unnoticed that I've been careful to sprinkle my story to date with such phrases as caeteris paribus and other things being equal. But is not, if all things considered I value A, then I ought to do B, closer to what we want? Perhaps. Yet what does all things considered mean? Without attempting a direct answer, let me sketch a classical theory, essentially Plato's, Plato in modern dress, which can be called the informed or enlightened self-interest model. It conceives of a ground floor of human valuations which arise naturally from our bodily, mental, and social needs. These specific valuings need not be ego-centered. Only the tough-minded, like Hobbes, thought that the valuing expressed by would that he not be suffering is really what would, as it were, undisguisedly be expressed by would that I not be in his shoes. But whatever the character of the ground floor or specific valuings, they, according to this model, are dominated by an overarching ego-directed valuing expressed in our terminology by would that I led a happy life. To the extent that people are logical, this valuing, combined with beliefs about the world and the propensities of our fellow man, and about what constitutes a happy life, generates a life plan valuing, which allots subordinate places to ground floor valuings and is carried out in action. Most people lead blurred and fluctuating lives because of their changing beliefs and the faltering grip of logic and the breaking in of impulse. Let us reintroduce our team of scientists. Let us now idealize them and suppose that they really know what things and persons are like. They turn their attention to a budding young genius, Jones again, and say among themselves, if Jones wants to lead a happy life, he ought to lead a life of kind L. The neo-Freudian Pavlovians among them, we suppose, have conclusively shown that for budding geniuses, L is the happy life. They go to Jones and say, if you want to lead a happy life, Jones, you ought to lead a life of kind L. And when he questions it, they persuade him to come to the Academy of Sciences. After years of studying, Jones says, I see, I understand, and proceeds to think along the following lines. If I want to live a happy life, I ought to live a life of kind L. Ex hypothesi, he has built into him the valuing, would that I led a happy life. Being logical, he now conjoins with this the valuing, would that I led a life of kind L. Drawing on additional knowledge he has gained in the academy, he continues, if I want to lead a life of kind L, I ought to do such and such actions in such and such circumstances. Always logical, he adds to his battery of valuations, would that I do such and such kinds of actions in such and such kinds of circumstances, where the policies he has in mind take account of all the subtle ways in which circumstances can vary and yet seem to casual inspection to be the same. Confronted with a particular circumstance C, he reasons, if I want to do A whenever I am in C, I ought to do A now, for C indeed obtains. As before, his valuings remain coherent, and he adds to the valuing, would that I now do A, which, since it constitutes his being favorably disposed to doing A, generates the action in question. Plato's basic analogy here is that of an act, of an art or craft. He develops in a number of dialogues the concept of an art of living, which he conceives of as the art of achieving happiness. Assuming that a shoemaker values, for whatever reason, the making of shoes, and that no other values become relevant during shoemaking hours, that he knows the various stages of making what the various stages of making a shoe require from him in the way of manipulating the leather, and that he knows how to do it, then he will turn to and make a good shoe within the limitations of the materials. So too, a man in possession of the art of living will turn to and create a happy life within the limitations of his opportunities. But what, it will be asked, what guarantees that our genius, Jones, however meticulously he plans his life and carries out his plan, will behave in the ways we think of as moral? In other words, what guarantees that the rules of the art of living coincide in their content with the content of the principles of morality? Mightn't the rules include such items as, would that whenever I have a ring which makes me invisible, I take all available loose cash to spend on research, not to mention more exotic pursuits. Plato has a lengthy argument designed to prove, essentially this is the aim of the Republic, to prove that the rules of the art of living coincide in content with what we think of as sound moral principles. The argument has more bite to it than is usually allowed, but this is because Plato tacitly introduces some themes from the next and concluding section of my lecture. Even if he were successful in showing the coincidence, however, he would not have succeeded in showing that the conclusion of the reasoning, since I want to lead a happy life, intermediate arguments, I ought therefore to do such and such kinds of acts in such and such kind of circumstances, is identical in sense with the statement, I morally ought to do those things in those circumstances. We find it quite meaningful, and alas, often true, to say, I morally ought to do such and such actions in such and such circumstances, even if it would result in my unhappiness, and other courses of action would make me happy. Yet we still have not shown that the ought of moral principles is not what we have called the ought of coherence, where the principles of coherence are supplied by logic and the other sciences. For the trouble may not lie with the pattern of Plato's theory, but with the valuing, which is postulated as the inbuilt motor of the well-lived life. In particular, the trouble may lie with the egoistic or self-centered nature of this valuing. An alternative goal might, it would seem, do the job. Our team of scientists return, You'll recognize in this team of scientists, of course, Plato's philosopher king. Our team of scientists return, and this time, we suppose with reason, they say, if Jones wants to promote the general welfare, he ought to do such and such things in such and such circumstances. And they now allow that a person can take the general welfare as a goal for its own sake. As before, they come to Jones and say, if and to the extent that you want to promote the general welfare, you ought to do such and such kinds of things in such and such kinds of circumstances, and take him to the academy. He returns to the world convinced and reasons. If, and to the extent that I want to promote the general welfare, I ought to do such and such kinds of actions in such and such kinds of circumstances. He is convinced, in other words, of the coherence of would that I promoted the general welfare and would that I did such and such kinds of actions in such and such kinds of circumstances. And the incoherence of would that I promoted the general welfare and would that I not do those kinds of actions in those kinds of circumstances. And other things being equal, he values the general welfare. This certainly has a more moral ring to it, and yet it is not completely satisfactory. And when we see why, we will have the answer to our problem. Our team of scientists might equally have pointed out that if Jones, and to the extent that Jones wants to promote the welfare of hummingbirds, he ought to do such and such kinds of actions in such and such kinds of circumstances. A coherent system of valuings along these lines is not egoistic, and yet it does not have the ring of morality. Even if we replace it by, if Jones wants, other things being equal, to promote the general welfare of language-using featherless bipeds, which comes a bit closer, we can picture Jones, who, other things being equal, also values his own happiness, confronted by two coherent subsystems of valuings. On the one hand, if I want other things being equal to be happy, I ought to pursue policies A. And on the other hand, if I want other things being equal to promote the general welfare, I ought, ceteris paribus, to pursue policy B, etc. And it is not clear how these can be resolved into a single, more embracing, coherent system of valuings, so that the ceteris paribus could be dropped and a simple ought remain. We feel that the moral ought is in principle embracing and unequivocal, i.e. that if we had ideal knowledge about what we ought to do would be uniquely determined. Egoistic plus ideal knowledge, egoism plus ideal knowledge, did uniquely determine an ought, but not the ought of moral reasoning. While if we recognize a duality of basic valuings, the moral pattern seems closer, but the uniqueness disappears. Is there any way in which the uniqueness desired by the philosopher of morals can be restored while retaining the idea that the moral ought is the ought of coherence? The first of the above objections gives the clue. People are not hummingbirds, not even language-using featherless bipeds. They are us. Or to come to the point, the moral point of view is not that in which we do good to the language-using featherless bipeds which surround us. It is that in which each of us seeks the common good of all of us as one of us. There is a sense in which we all understand this, but how is it to be understood in the abstract categories of philosophy? The terminology developed at the beginning will prove, I believe, invaluable. It will be remembered that I distinguished between the sentence which expresses a valuing, would that such and such were the case, and the sentence which ascribes the valuing to someone. For example, Jones values such and such. Now, in the examples I have been considering, it has been tacitly assumed that Jones values whatever he values, so to speak, as himself, and from a personal point of view. Let us therefore use a device, lurking in, but not highlighted by ordinary language, to bring this out in the very expression of the valuing. I would that X were the case. Not just would that X were the case, but I would that X were the case. For this is to be an expression of the valuing, indicating that one is speaking, so to speak, from one's own point of view. The corresponding ascription would be Jones, from a personal point of view, values whatever it is the Senator's winning in 1966. Notice that from a personal point of view, it doesn't mean selfishly, nor does it preclude it. One can be, as it were, sympathetic from a personal point of view. So I certainly don't want you to identify here the personal point of viewishness of certain valuings with their being selfish. What are we to contrast with this valuing from a personal point of view? The very terminology should give a clue. I spoke above of valuing something as being a member of one's community. And since I am concerned with the moral point of view, I have in mind the most embracing community to which we belong, those who are, in the biblical sense of the term, our brothers. To value in this way is to think in terms of us, in terms of we, in this embracing sense. Thus, we would that such and such were the case. Notice that it is still the individual who is valuing. You're not to think of this as a kind of chorus. The point is that the individual is actually thinking in terms of his membership in the group. And he says, he thinks in these terms. We would that this were the case. We would that the Senators won in 1966. Notice that it is still, as I said, the individual who is valuing. The corresponding ascription sentence would be, Jones values X as one of us. In other words, as a member of the group. It's as a member of the group that he values what he values. So it's the individual who is valuing, but he's valuing in a different frame of reference, so to speak. Indeed, from a moral point of view. Valuing has, if I may so put it, a subjective form as well as a content. Let me emphasize that from the fact that Jones values something as one of us, it doesn't follow that we value X. In other words, it doesn't follow that everybody does it. Everybody shares that value. We're talking now about a certain form in which an individual values something, and it can be true that Jones values something as one of us, while it's actually false that the rest of us value it. He may be, as it were, off in left field as far as the valuing is concerned, or we may be. We may well, indeed often do, differ in what we value as members of the community. Yet in principle, there could be agreement. And in principle, there would be agreement, which I want to show. Let me give a parallel from our discussion of self-interest. The specific things Jones values may differ from time to time as his beliefs about human nature and the world change. But in relation to the valuing of a happy life on the whole, then in principle, i.e., if he had at all times the knowledge provided by our team of scientists, our ideal team, it will be remembered, of scientists, he would have agreed with himself at all times about the valuings consistent with his overarching aim. There is in principle agreement, so to speak, between Jones of T1, Jones of T2, Jones of 1966. His disagreements with himself at different times are in principle resolvable. The same is true of the members of a community insofar as they aim at the common good. Thus, if our team of ideal scientists considers the community, they can, we suppose, by virtue of their knowledge of individuals and groups, come up with something with the following form. If the members of the community value promoting the common good, they ought to support such and such practices. And addressing themselves to the group, if any of you values promoting the common good as a member of the community, from a moral point of view, he ought to support such and such practices. And convinced, let us suppose, by scientific arguments, each member of the community, for example, Jones, will reason. If I value, as one of us, i.e. from the moral point of view, the common good, I ought to support doing such and such things, the practice of doing such and such things in such and such circumstances. Which tells him that the valuings would that the common good was promoted and would that the practice of doing such and such things in such and such circumstances were supported, cohere. Thus, from the moral point of view, he is confronted by the logical ought. Since I value the promotion of the common good, I ought to support the practice of doing such and such kinds of actions in such and such kinds of circumstances. And since the same consideration would confront each member, and they share the same primary value, which their other valuings are with which their other valuings are to cohere, they would share valuings of the form, we would, that if any of us is in a certain kind of circumstance, he ought to do a certain kind of action. Which is, I submit, the valuational content of a moral principle. The ought, in the more familiar formulation, expresses the coherence of the valuing with the valuing of the common good in the light of relevant facts about man and the world. These valuings are, and remember I'm talking about an ideal situation where the members of our community have access to ideal knowledge. These valuings are, though valuings by individuals, universal in three dimensions. I think the only philosopher who's seen this, and I'm not sure that he always sees it clearly, is Kant. And the themes I'm developing are very Kantian in their structure. In the first place, the valuings, for example, we would, that if any of us is in circumstances C, he do A, is universal in its content. Because the content is, notice, that if any of us is in C, he do A. That if any of us is in C, he do A. We can call this universality of application or content. Secondly, these valuings are universal in their subjective form, because it is a valuing as one of any of us, one of the community, one of all of us, if you will. They are universal in their subjective form. Thirdly, they are universal in their acceptance, i.e. in the fact that all the members of the community agree in this value, that they share this value. Alas, the ideal knowledge of our philosophical fiction, shared by all, is not even at hand, let alone shared. Thus the ideal, if I may use the word in this area, consensus, sketched above, is only in principle there. Just as the agreement between ourselves at different times of our lives in the search for happiness is in principle, only in principle there. And reasoning in the moral point of view proceeds in a context of disagreement and diversity of opinion and confusion. Yet the question, what ought I to do in these particular circumstances with which serious moral reasoning begins? What ought I to do in these circumstances from the moral point of view is at heart the question, what would we that I do in these circumstances? What would we that I do in these circumstances? And to answer this question is to answer the question, what would we think that any of us do? Rather, what would we that any of us do in these circumstances? In other words, to ask what one ought to do is to ask what anyone ought to do. To ask what would we that I do is to ask what would we that anybody do. And this again is to answer the question, to answer this is to answer the question on what valuing of the form we would that any of us did that in these circumstances, would we agree? On what valuing of that form would we agree if we had ideal knowledge? And this again, the question, what practices would we agree to be conducive to the common good if we had ideal knowledge? What practices concerning this kind of situation would we agree to be conducive to the general good, the common good, if we had ideal knowledge? Yet since the one who asks these questions lacks the ideal knowledge, he must make the best of such knowledge or belief as he has. Though actually we know far more than we think about human nature and its propensities and needs, one is often tempted to say, we generally, and particularly the novelists, know far more than do the psychologists. That's a snide remark about some limitations of the enterprise of psychology at the present time in certain of its primary concerns. If my argument is sound, the moral ought is the ought of coherence, once again. But this time, coherence in the moral point of view. Thus, where inclination, whether selfish or sympathetic, points in one direction, and moral valuation in another, the tension is between two different ways of valuing, not simply between two values which we have from our own point of view. Yet we are, more frequently than we are willing to allow, confronted by a choice between actions, one of which is called for by one way of thought, the other by the other. It is notorious that the outcome does not always have its source in the moral point of view. Does our argument not commit us to the idea that the moral point of view and the personal point of view are unrelated alternatives? Two alternatives which simply present an either-or. The either-or aspect is not to be ignored. Yet at the level our argument is reached, we can see how there might be a harmony between the two points of view, a harmony more basic than the slipshod attempt, criticized before, to fit self-interest and sympathy into a coherent framework of valuings from the personal point of view and call it morality. Most people live on second-hand moral thinking and the momentum of childhood training. Suppose such a person were to meditate as follows. Granted that I and my fellows have been brought up to have such and such commitments as to what one is to do in various kinds of circumstance, why shouldn't I let these commitments wither away and encourage self-regarding, vigorous attitudes? Is there any reason why I should nourish my commitment to the moral point of view? What could we say? In effect, we have seen that the only frame of mind which is the living source of moral commitment is what Josiah Royce called loyalty and what Christians call love or charity. This is a commitment deeper than any commitment to abstract principle. It is this commitment to the well-being of our fellow men which stands to the justification of moral principles as the purpose of acquiring the ability to explain and predict, stands to the justification of scientific theories. This concern for others is a precious thing, the foundation for which is laid in early childhood, though it can come about in adult years through the little understood phenomena of conversion and psychotherapy. I will close this lecture with the remark that recent psychological studies seem to make clear what has in a sense been known all along, that the ability to love others for their own sake is as essential to a full life as the need to feel ourselves loved and appreciated for our own sakes, unconditionally, and not as something turned off or on depending on what we do. This fact provides for those who acknowledge it a connection which can justify a course of action designed to strengthen our ability to respond to the needs of others. Thus, really intelligent and informed self-love supports the love of one's neighbor, which alone directly supports the moral point of view when, as the 18th century British divine, Bishop Butler, put it, we sit down in a cool hour and ask why we should do our duty.
We just heard an address by Professor Wilfrid Sellars, and his topic was Science and Ethics, a Study in the First Principles. And now I believe we're going to have questions entertained from the floor. Dr. Durfee is coming to the podium.
Professor Sellars has consented to entertain your queries. We have a roving mic here, or someone will only indicate where the question is. Who would like to start? Yes, sir.
I was wondering, given that man is committed to acting for the common good, were you saying that given this commitment and ideal knowledge, the scientist could tell us what to do?
He can tell us what would be consistent with that commitment.
So in other words, common good is a descriptive...
Yes.
Common good is determinable by science.
Yes. I'm not saying that they've determined it.
Supposing someone said, I think the common good of all men is to have pleasure. And supposing someone else said, I think the common good of all men is the intellectual life. Could science arbitrate this disagreement?
In principle, yes.
What sort of evidence would be relevant to decide that?
This is the $64,000 question, which concerns the scientific knowledge of human needs and human nature. And this is a matter of fact which can be discovered. Any commitment to bringing it about, of course, is something that involves love and is not itself a descriptive matter of fact.
You don't think then that there's an is-ought dichotomy here?
There's a what?
You don't think that the is-ought dichotomy has crept in again?
No.
Another question? That's right.
Doesn't the is-ought dichotomy creep in again in another form, namely in a dichotomy between two kinds of oughts? The ought about ends and the ought about means. The ought about ends and the instrumental ought. Whereas the ought about means, or the instrumental ought, is one which is scientific in nature and which can be answered or which can be resolved in scientific terms, in terms of knowledge and information. The ought about ends is one to which I find it difficult to think how science can give the answer.
I think we have to distinguish here between intermediate ends and primary ends. There are two kinds of moral principles, actually. I've concentrated on the one here. There are oughts to be and oughts to do. Now, for example, supposing we say people ought to feel grieved when a loved one dies. This is not an ought to do, it's an ought to feel, it's an ought to be in a certain way. And we can say that here is a state of affairs that is desirable and not simply desired. But you see, I am arguing that even principles pertaining to what ought to be as opposed to what ought to be done are themselves derivative ultimately from this commitment to the eudaimonia is the best word I can use here. Not the word happiness, which is a misleading term, but the satisfactory, the fulfilled kind of life for the community, which I've been talking about.
Yes, but isn't this in itself an ultimate ought about what I call ends, which in itself is not determinable by recourse to fact?
I would say again that it's an ultimate end with respect to which the oughtness of all intermediate ends is to be evaluated. In other words, why do we say that people ought to feel grieved when a loved one dies? You see, my point is that we say this because this pattern of life in which people are grieved when a loved one dies is one which itself makes an essential contribution to the common good.
Yes, but in scientific terms and in terms of appeal to facts, why ought we be committed to the eudaimonia?
I'm not saying that we ought to be. I'm saying that either we are or we aren't. Then I go on to say that it can be shown, and I think we all know, that it's only if you do have this commitment that you yourself can actually can lead a satisfying life.
And these are matters.
Now, see, the word fact is one of these words, that is like an accordion, Fact can be the rain is falling, or a fact can be something importantly true about human nature. And I think one has to be very careful to bear in mind the whole panorama of fact, which I was mobilizing in my discussion.
Professor Sellars, to pursue that a bit further, you said, as we all know. Are you now saying this is self-evident as opposed to being demonstrable in a scientific manner? I mean, is this something...
What is it that you're speaking about?
This end, or eudaimonia, or whichever you wish to choose, which is, as you seem to say, intuitively obvious to all of us.
I'm not clear what you mean by speaking of it as being obvious or unobvious.
You said, as we all know, we can only be happy.
No, I didn't. I said at the end, I have argued that, in addition, that it's only by virtue of this commitment that we actually can. Now, I put this forward as a matter of scientific fact.
You're not?
I am, yes, but not as something that's self-evident. I've made no claims about anything being self-evident.
But it is something that is scientifically demonstrable?
I think so, yes.
Well, could you tell us a bit more? It seems to be bothering the field.
Well, you see, let me put it this way. I'm talking at two levels. On the one hand, I pointed out that we know a great deal more about man and what makes him happy, what will satisfy him, than we, you might say, think we do when we read the scientific journal. Because, in a certain sense, man, over his history, has learned a great deal about human nature and its needs, you see, which the scientists have to approach from another direction, from the back door, through the study of white rats. So, on the one hand, you see, I'm talking about what, in a sense, we know at the common sense level. On the other hand, I'm deliberately idealizing this, you see, trying to project this into what I would argue to be, and of course this it would be a long story, as the implications of the philosophical implications of science. In other words, I certainly would not dream of supposing that I had given here a demonstration of anything. What I've done is to show that there's a pattern which can be seen at two levels. One, the level where we all, in a sense, know what would be a satisfying life, and the other, which we think of this as the achievement of a science which is studying, seriously studying, and studying in a way which we can just dimly conceive the needs and propensities of human nature and social fact and so on. I know I'm showing that a certain pattern of reasoning which has existed in philosophy has much to recommend it.
But nevertheless, despite the existence of this common sense emerged in nature prior controversial because they are not perhaps demonstrated.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. I certainly, and I didn't claim that they were self-evident. I didn't claim that everybody agreed upon them. If they did, moral philosophy would not have existed in its turmoil for several thousand years.
But you seem to be claiming that in principle, at any rate, there is some basis in the new
I think so, yes.
proper facts
Right.
why this controversy could be eliminated. In other words, it's not different in kind.
That's right.
It has been traditionally different, only because this area has not been sufficiently investigated the way others have. It's not different in kind.
That's right. And a fact is a fact, whether it be the rain falling or a fact about what would lead to a life that we could be satisfied with.